Welcome to 10 Minutes on Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, a podcast from the Joint Public Issues team. My name is Florence, I'm one of the JPIT interns, and joining me today is Steve Hucklesby, Policy Advisor at JPIT. Hi, Steve.
Hi there, it's really good to be with you.
Brilliant. So this week is a big week in disarmament and non-proliferation, with the 5th of March being International Day for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation Awareness. These are all big words and long names. Would you please explain what this means?
Sure. It's a day when people from the world come together to raise their voices to try and reduce the risk of nuclear weapons and try and get things moving on disarmament. This movement of civil society people across the world and civil society groups teamed up with nations and diplomats to achieve the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which took place in 2017. People may recall that ICANN, the global campaign, won the Nobel Peace Prize in that year. And so it's a special week in which we can continue that work. And it's also coincide this week with a meeting of the state parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So governments are coming together this week to see how they can cooperate under the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's a treaty which is not accepted by the UK government, but we would like our government to be there as an observer in order to strengthen the relationships with states who are determined to see more action across the world on nuclear disarmament.
Okay, so certainly a big week in the world of fighting against nuclear weapons. And
absolutely it is, yeah.
So there are two kind of main treaties going on here, the TPNW,
yep,
but also the NPT, which was put in place back in 1970. That's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, an older treaty. Would you mind telling us the state of that particular treaty?
Yeah, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has been really important over the past decades. It has virtually every country in the world signed up to it. So it has largely been credited by many as being responsible for reducing the number of new nuclear weapons states in the world. There are only 9. At the time of signing of the NPT, or a bit before that, governments were predicting that by now there might be 25 nuclear states in the world. That has not taken place. So this is a pretty important treaty, but with what is going on in the world at the moment, with extraordinary scenes between Russia, United States, China entering the nuclear fray and building weapons as well, I think people are pretty unsettled as to whether the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is strong enough to survive, and if it were not to survive, what would happen as a result.
And I mean, I have to ask, with the current international situation with the US, how do you think Donald Trump is going to impact this work around nuclear weapons?
It's amazing, isn't it? We really are in unprecedented territory regarding the relationships between the United States and Europe. Donald Trump seems to have this sort of mercantilist approach to foreign affairs and security, and the US in recent weeks has broken ranks with Europe in terms of protection of Ukraine in quite an extraordinary way, and I would say in a way which is unprecedented in modern era and since the end of the Second World War. Zelensky, throughout the Ukraine conflict, has been making the case that Ukraine soldiers, many who have paid with their lives, are defending not only Ukraine, but also defending Western democracy and the international order. They are defending the rule of law by resisting Russia in its illegal invasion and occupation. This ought to be appreciated by European states and also by the United States, but clearly Donald Trump doesn't see it that way. He wants Ukraine to pay the US in rare earth minerals in return for US arms to ensure that Ukraine can defend itself. And this seems to be outrageous. It's a sort of gangsterism in international politics. It's saying, we'll support you in arms as long as you pay us money. It's almost like a sort of mafia protection racket. It's an approach to international affairs and to foreign policy that seems to be totally devoid of any underlying principle. And Governments in Europe are grappling with at the moment with how to tackle this. So you've got the incoming German Chancellor Merz this week who's speculated even that NATO itself could collapse by the end of this year, and that Europe needs to build a sort of European version of NATO as a response. So what's happening is so extraordinary. It's almost, difficult to predict where this is going to go over the next few months. It's obviously causing all governments in Europe to have to increase their defense spending quite drastically to support Ukraine. But what that might mean for future cooperation with the United States is really difficult to predict at this stage.
It's absolutely shocking the way that Donald Trump is speaking about Ukraine and those demands.
It's bizarre, but then he's bizarre in many ways.
Yeah. So bringing this kind of close to home then, what does this mean for UK defence and UK nuclear weapons policy?
Well, of course, the UK, in terms of defence, has been closer to the United States than any other nation in Europe. So in terms of nuclear weapons, we use US nuclear missile, the Trident missile. We develop our own warhead, but we develop it on the basis of a US-UK joint design. When I say joint design, most people would say US design. And our nuclear weapons are very much dependent on America's goodwill. We've got a nuclear program that's going to have an eye-watering cost over the next 10, 20, 30 years. For 30 years, it's going to cost the UK over £200 billion to maintain nuclear weapons. And as I say, at the moment, this is all dependent on Donald Trump thinking that this mutual defense agreement that we have with the United States is worth pursuing and continuing. It's very clear that this agreement on nuclear cooperation is based on the mutual values and principles behind security which both nations hold, and which, of course, Donald Trump at the moment is just ripping to shreds.
My goodness. So most of the people listening will be church goers, church leaders, and we can all feel quite powerless when we hear all of this. So I just wanted to ask you, Steve, what should a Christian response be? Is there something we can do? What can we be praying for? I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, well, we can't deny that the world is becoming a more dangerous place, and that causes some people to be a little bit conservative with a small c in terms of changes to defense policy. I think that what churches have consistently underlined is that nuclear weapons are intrinsically immoral. These are weapons that cannot be used in any battlefield conflict. We have tactical nuclear weapons, which supposedly some governments are suggesting could be used in that way. We even have the United States wanting to place their tactical nuclear weapons on UK soil at the moment. There is a plan for the United States to bring its nuclear weapons to the UK, although we managed to get rid of them in 2008. It is something that our government is avoiding talking about in response to questions from MPs. And so we're only getting our news on nuclear weapons coming to UK soil through the little tidbits being fed out by the United States Department of Defense. That in itself is a travesty, because then MPs are unable to do their job in holding our government to account. It's at a time when we face these significant risks that we all need to work that much harder to say that these nuclear weapons are a different thing. They are destruction on a different scale. And we should all be able to agree, as the United States and Russia did a few years ago, that nuclear disarmament is an absolute priority.
Mm-hmm. And so what advice would you give for a church leader wondering how they might talk about this, think about this, pray about this? Do you have any thoughts on that?
We've got resources on the JPIT website, and please use those. Please use resources of Christian CND. One thing, I think, if there was one action that people were to take at this moment, it would be to ask our government to send representatives to the meeting on the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. As we've said, the meeting of state parties is meeting this week. The UK government is chosen to not engage with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It's chosen thus far not to sit down with states that are promoting nuclear disarmament. It's chosen not to engage with them in the same room. We would like to see that change when the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons has its next meeting of state parties. It's very much our hope the UK government will pursue a strategy of engagement with the 67 states that have ratified the treaty, 94 states around the world that have signed the treaty. It's very much my wish that the UK government engages in conversation with those states, even if it doesn't share their position at the moment. So that's the one very practical thing that we might do. But apart from that, we need to continue to do what we always have done as churches, and simply to state that nuclear weapons, because of their indiscriminate effect, are immoral. And that even when times are difficult in the world, we need to raise our voices around that and urge governments to go further and do more.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for speaking to me, Steve. I certainly have learned so much about this topic, so it's been really helpful. If you'd like to find out more of our work on arms and peacemaking, do head to our website, jpit.uk. That's JPIT.uk for actions, resources, all around peacemaking and arms. We've also got our Future of Arms project, which looks at modern advances in warfare, so things like AI in autonomous weapons. So do look that up. I will put all of the links in the show notes below. But yeah, thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it around.